Face America. I'm Hugh in Studio West. There's a storm of news out of Israel. So I turned to former Israeli ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren. Dr. Oren is in the United States to celebrate the inauguration. I'll bet you it reminds you of your home place of New York, Michael, because it's got to be cold in D.C. today.
The air is not breathable. If you need an ice pick to breathe.
Not a good thing.
Last night, going into the Liberty Ball, we were stuck outside for about 2 hours in this thing, and people were literally passing out. It is, what can I say, apocalyptic. But it did not hamper the joy of the event. A truly extraordinary experience. And, we've been up for several nights from, balls and receptions. I'm a recovering inauguraholic, probably, you can call it. But with that, also the events in Israel, as you said, the return of the 3 hostages, the question about whether phase 1 of the ceasefire will continue to phase 2 of the ceasefire, the great and fateful questions facing the Israeli government.
What did you make of President Trump's statement yesterday? He wasn't certain that the deal would hold, after having said all hell would break loose if hostages were not getting out.
Well, I think it's very clear. Hamas has never kept a ceasefire. It didn't keep the ceasefire on October 7th. There was a ceasefire in place. It didn't keep the ceasefire a month later when we had the first hostage release. It didn't keep the ceasefire for more than 4 days. And what will happen, I'm willing to wager on it. You're going to see violation of the ceasefire. Hamas is going to say it's not us, it's some breakaway faction, and there'll be some rockets and there'll be some ambushes. And then you have Hamas in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank carrying out terrorist attacks. And well, hey, that's not covered by the ceasefire. So I think the president's words speak for themselves. Certainly, they're backed up empirically by history.
4 more hostages will be released on Saturday. And according to the deal, the details of all 33 of phase 1 release are supposed to be done this weekend. Do you expect Hamas to at least hang in there through the weekend?
No, not really. They'll always try to strike that. Remember, we're dealing with a terrorist group that deals not just with physical terror, but also emotional and psychological terror all the time. We don't know how many of these hostages are coming back in ambulances, how many are coming back in boxes. We're particularly concerned about the Beavis boys, Ariel and Kfir, they're the youngest hostages. We don't know if they're alive, how they're coming back. And the impact on Israeli society, I guarantee you, will be profound.
Are you surprised to learn this morning that Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi has announced he's retiring in March?
Not at all. I'm surprised he's held on for this long. And what a almost Greek tragic figure he is. Here's a person who's named for an uncle who fell in the 1967 war, a storied paratrooper who fell in the battle for Jerusalem, who now bears responsibility for the greatest single military defeat in Israel's history, certainly since the 1973 the Yom Kippur War. And yet who, without hesitation, didn't break. He didn't break. He came back, and he fought a war on seven fronts. And by all military estimates, what West Point will be studying in 50 years from now, basically won on all 7 fronts. And so, yes, in Israel, no one's above taking responsibility. And he's taken personal responsibility. He's called on the government to take responsibility. Other officers will be following suit. This is going to be a major, major turnover in Israel's military leadership, and I suspect in Israel's political leadership as well.
Ambassador Oren, there's a story in the Financial Times today. Is Hamas back? I'm going to ask you. They were out in force this week with the green bandanas and the black headbands and all of that. Are they back?
Yeah, the question is, are they back in force? They're not back in the force, certainly, that existed on October 7th. They've been vastly downgraded. And the people you see marching around with the green bandanas are the people who have managed to survive somehow. And the only reason they've survived is because of the hostages, not because of Israel's lack of military prowess or stick-to-itiveness. There are areas of Gaza which the Israeli army could not enter because of the fear that hostages were being held there. And we know now, tragically, we know that when we enhance or ratchet up the pressure on Hamas militarily, Hamas doesn't release hostages, Hamas shoots hostages. And so, yes, inevitably, some of these Hamas terrorists will survive.
So, Dr. Oren, you've got Marco Rubio is the new Secretary of State. Michael Waltz is the new National Security Advisor. Pete Hegseth will soon be the Secretary of Defense. What do you make of the new team?
A team. From Israel's perspective, a total A team. Couldn't get any better. I know most of these individuals personally. Extraordinary when it comes to defending Israel, when it comes to standing up to Iran. Couldn't get any better. But I always caution. I caution Israelis that these remarkable individuals, as blessed as they are, do not make policy; they carry out policy. And in the American system, policy is made by one individual principally. He can be influenced, he can be persuaded, but he makes that policy, and that individual is Donald Trump.
I'm going to ask Lahav this as well because she's in Jerusalem, but you know this as well as anyone as well. Times of Israel: IDF launches major counterterror raid in West Bank's Jenin, expected the last days. All I know about the West Bank I learned from Fauda, which means I don't know anything about the West Bank. It's a TV show. What is the likelihood of success in Judea and Samaria of IDF operations over the long haul?
Well, there'll always be success. They'll always be successful. It's not a matter of being successful. The question is whether how much of a respite it buys us from terror. There's always going to be terror there. There always has been terror there since 1967, and it comes in waves. And I think certainly now the sense that Hamas has in Gaza that it's won this round of the battle, that people are parading and celebrating, has given a fillip to Hamas cells in Judea and Samaria and other jihadist groups in Judea and Samaria, and Israel is acting to defend us against them and to eliminate them. But the others will sprout in their place. So it's an ongoing struggle. Jenin's in the northern part of the West Bank. It's in Samaria, and it's been that area in which Palestinian Authority control has almost disappeared at times. And that vacuum has been filled by Hamas and these other jihadist groups, the Lion's Den, for example, or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They're all acting in the cities of northern Samaria, which is Jenin, Tulkarm, and mostly Nablus. And that's where the Israeli army has had to be the most active.
Do they have that tunnel network up there, or is it simply people with guns in the walls?
Oh, they're trying. They're trying with the tunnels. They're trying with rockets. They've got their playbook. And there, the tunnels are more dangerous because that is our longest and most porous border. And we've already discovered tunnels that the Palestinians have started to excavate that have aimed at some of our major cities that are right along that border. Kfar Saba, for example, major Israeli city. And there have been Palestinian gunmen who've just simply gone out in the street and emptied their Kalashnikov magazines in the direction of one of these Israeli cities. Those bullets go a long way. And even at several thousand yards, they'll penetrate a wall and penetrate a human being.
So, Mr. Ambassador, last question. You know everyone in this game, but I don't know Mr. Witkoff, the new special envoy to the Middle East. I know the accounts of the meetings he had with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I don't know if they're true or not. Do you think Israel has won in Lebanon? I want to just focus on Lebanon. Nathan Hochstein spent enough time there to get a passport, I think, from Lebanon, but I don't know that anything is actually secure there. What's your assessment as the new team arrives?
Well, it depends on how you frame the question, and I'll try to make this as short as possible. In purely military terms, Israel has done the impossible. It encountered obstacles both in Gaza, Lebanon, and elsewhere that no other army in history has ever had to grapple with, and in every single front prevailed. And that includes in the air, striking at Yemen, striking at Iran at fantastic distances, refueling in the air, and not losing a single airplane. In purely military terms, Israel is a historic victory. In geostrategic terms, it's a mixed bag. On one hand, Hezbollah is still alive. It can come back. It's still a formidable force. Hamas, as we've mentioned, is still alive and can certainly resurface and regroup and rearm. In the West Bank, as we mentioned, the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria remain pretty much unscathed. And look at the Houthis. The Houthis are still firing at us. But in the long run, and this is a big question, Syria has fallen apart as a result of Israel's military victories. Iran is isolated and weakened in a way that has not been perhaps ever. And hopefully with the Trump administration, Israel and the United States can take advantage of this unique and potentially transformative geopolitical situation in the Middle East and make an entirely new region that will strengthen Israel, strengthen America, strengthen the world, and greatly enhance stability throughout the Middle East and beyond.
Gosh, I hope so. That is certainly the hope. Dr. Michael Oren, ambassador, former ambassador of Israel to the United States. Enjoy the rest of the very cold inaugural celebration week in Washington, D.C. Get a coat, Mr. Ambassador. Get a coat. I'll be right back, America, with from Jerusalem. Lahav Harkov joins me next on the Hugh Hewitt Show. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt in Studio West. Lahav Harkov has been with the Jewish Insider for many, many years. She is also currently the senior political correspondent for Jewish Insider. You can follow her on X at Lahav Harkov. She joins me now from Israel. Good evening, Lahav. Thank you for being with me.
Thanks for having me on.
I would like to begin with the confirmation from Hamas today that 4 female hostages will be released on Saturday. Do you think the deal is going to hold beyond those 4?
I think it's a possibility that it will hold beyond those 4. I think the more sort of open question is whether it will hold beyond the first 6 weeks. We could also ask if it will hold the entire 6 weeks, but I wouldn't be surprised if it holds for a few weeks. It's just once we get to the point where they're negotiating further stages of the deal, further where they would be releasing soldiers that they're holding captive, and where they would expect the IDF to withdraw more fully from Gaza. I think that those are going to be the sticking points.
Lahav, there are emotional reactions across the range. I read the Times of Israel every day, Jewish Insider, try and get to Ynet, as much English language Israeli media as possible. You're there. First, I'd like to ask, what's your personal response to the agreement?
It's very mixed feelings. I mean, the day that the 3 women got out, of course, it was incredibly emotional and exciting. And we were all just so happy, really to the point of tears, just seeing these women reunited with their families. That being said, there are really mixed feelings because, over 1,000 terrorists are going to be released from Israeli prison, including ones who have murdered many Israelis, committed some of the worst atrocities of the Second Intifada. You asked me personally, my husband did 200 days of reserve duty since the beginning of the war, and mostly in the West Bank, which is where a lot of these terrorists are going to be. And he's going to have to confront them again. And I think there's tens of thousands of, wives, sisters, mothers of soldiers and soldiers on reserve duty who feel the same way, that this is putting them all in danger.
So in terms of where the terrorists being released are going, they are going to the West Bank. They're not being released into Gaza.
So the ones who are serving life sentences will not be released to the West Bank. So they'll be sent to Gaza, in some cases Turkey or maybe Qatar. It's sort of unclear. They're not giving specific information. But a lot of these people who helped plan things, or maybe they set off a bomb that ended up not killing anyone, so they're not serving a life sentence, they'll go to the West Bank.
Okay. Now, I also read in the Times of Israel story that on Sunday, Hamas is obligated under the agreement to provide the details of all 33 of the hostages who are covered by the first phase, whether they are alive or dead or their condition. Is that a red line for you, that if that list doesn't appear, that Israel ought to withdraw from the agreement?
I think that they should be giving that information in a timely manner before each release each week, right? I believe it's supposed to be 24 hours before the release. Last time they were 18 hours late. And so Israel waited before actually, holding fire and entering the ceasefire until it got that information. So, I think that the information needs to come in a timely manner. I'm not sure exactly whether we're supposed to be getting it all at once or week to week. But certainly if it's not coming in advance, if they're sort of withholding the information and not keeping to the general sort of lines of the deal, then I do think it will become a red line, because how can we trust them moving forward?
Right. There is a lot of news out of Israel today that I'll get to in a second, but I want to ask your personal reaction to the reappearance of Hamas fighters above ground with their bandanas and black hoods and covered faces. Again, Hamas is supposed to have been eradicated, obviously hasn't been. What was your reaction to that?
So, for starters, I don't think that anyone is saying that Hamas was eradicated, including, Israel's leadership. They say, ranging from 80 to 90%. Um, and obviously, when you look at those pictures, they're sort of horrifying because it looks like Hamas is out in full force again. I know that Israeli intelligence assessments are that even if Hamas is managing to recruit some new people, that they still are seriously degraded, and there's a lot fewer people than before. So I find that somewhat reassuring. But I do believe that Israel still has more work to do. We entered this ceasefire, but if we end the war, if this ceasefire becomes the end of the war, then we will have not reached our objective of eliminating Hamas as a fighting force and a government, certainly not as a governing force in Gaza. I mean, they're very much the only sort of administrative power there.
Now, the surprising hard news from today, I'm so glad you're here today, is that Israeli Defense Forces Chief Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, who we've seen a lot of in the 15 months since the massacre on 10/7, announced he will be leaving the IDF in March, assuming the permission of the political leadership in the Israeli cabinet. Are you surprised by this announcement?
I'm surprised by the timing. I'm not surprised that it eventually came. I think that the IDF sort of top brass were among the first people to take responsibility after October 7th and say that, we really failed and that we are responsible for the failure of the system, the failure to defend the Western Negev, the towns near the Gaza border. So I knew this day would come eventually. I guess he has some level of confidence in this ceasefire that it's going to hold at least long enough to find him a replacement. And so that's why he chose this time.
Well, after the catastrophic failure of 10/7, the IDF has been nothing short of magnificent across 7 fronts. And in fact, the strategic defeat for Iran, coupled with a strategic defeat for Hezbollah and what could well be a strategic defeat for Hamas, we don't know yet, is a salute to the feat of arms done by the IDF. Is that just part? It's not. I'm asking, is there no way to erase culpability for 10/7?
I think that if you ask the average Israeli, they're sort of very proud of what the army has achieved since October 7th, but that people view the leadership as sort of responsible. Um, and, there's a word that people use in Hebrew called the conceptia, which sort of means like a misconception or a preconception, and that people talk about as the failure, which is that just the way that Israel's leadership, which military and civilian, looked at Gaza was so mistaken and helped lead to this October 7th disaster. And so I think that people still view, despite the positive things that have happened since October 7th, they still view the leadership as responsible. I think that's true for the political leadership as well. Even though Netanyahu is rallying in the polls, I think many Israelis think that he should not seek re-election.
I will be right back with Lahav Harkov from the Jewish Insider. You can follow her on X at Lahav Harkov. It's very easy to find. Lavah is how you just start to type it and it will pop up. When we come back, I want to talk to her about who takes over for the Lieutenant General who's resigned and what is going on in the West Bank today. As I said, big news day for Israel, as Dr. Oren and Lahav have said. Stay tuned. I'm back now with Lahav Harkov of the Jewish Insider. She is their senior political correspondent, joining us from, I believe, Jerusalem this morning. Lahav, my next question is, who picks the replacement for the head of the IDF when the Lieutenant General leaves?
It's the defense minister and the prime minister together, basically. They have to agree on someone. There's already a likely candidate that's already sort of come out, that's the sort of military insiders have written about in Israel. And it's a former general named Eyal Zamir, who's today the director general of the defense ministry. It's sort of like the top bureaucratic position in the defense ministry that many former generals will. The job's usually filled by a former general.
So he was not in line command on 10/7?
He was not. He was Netanyahu's top choice for chief of staff. back in 2021 when Netanyahu was voted out of office. And then that short-lived government, which was around for about a year and a half, they were the ones who appointed the current chief of staff, who just resigned.
Last question, Lahav, because we got about 4 minutes. The headline in the Times of Israel this afternoon is IDF launches major counter-terror raid in West Bank, Jenin, expected to last days. So the war is on pause in Gaza. It appears to be over in Lebanon. What is the West Bank in terms of threat level?
It's definitely a higher threat level than before October 7th, 2023. That being said, in the months before October 7th, things were pretty hot there. There were a lot of terrorist attacks coming out of the West Bank and a lot of attacks on soldiers in the West Bank. So it's been sort of like an ongoing arena of this war the entire time, even if the intensity has been lower than Gaza. There's a lot of concerns about Iran smuggling weapons over from Jordan into Israel. That border is too porous, and there's a lot of talk about building some sort of physical separation between the West Bank and Jordan now. And so this is meant to eradicate some of that Iranian influence on terrorists in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank. For the past month or so, the Palestinian Authority itself has actually been pushing back against this terrorist cell in Jenin, a town that has long been problematic in terms of the influence of extremists. But the Palestinian Authority was not having enough success in that realm for Israel. And so now the IDF is going in for a more intensive operation in the coming days.
So, Lahav, like many Americans, my knowledge of the West Bank is based on Fauda and what I can read in English language sources. Do you think Americans have any idea of the complexity of urban warfare against terrorist guerrillas in the West Bank?
I don't, but to be fair, I don't think most Israelis understand really what's going on in the West Bank day to day. It's very complicated. It's also very close to Israelis. I mean, there are parts of Israel, the sort of non-West Bank parts of Israel that are only a few miles wide. And so regardless of whether one believes in a two-state solution or not, an unstable West Bank with a lot of extremists endangers, pre-1967 Israel and greater Israel, no matter what, people think the solution should be.
Last question, Lahav, and thanks for the extra time. In Fauda, it is presented that the Palestinian Authority works with Shin Bet and other agencies inside of the Israeli government to try and keep a lid on the most radical extremists. Is that in fact true, or is the PAA just taking the money and running?
It is and it isn't. There are definitely cases where the PA will turn people into Israel because they themselves don't want to take care of certain extremist elements, because they're worried that if they're seen as the people who are arresting these people, then they'll be less popular. It'll destabilize the Palestinian Authority. And there is some cooperation. It sort of ebbs and flows depending on the relations between Ramallah and Jerusalem. That being said, the Palestinian Authority also pays monthly salaries to the families of terrorists in prison and the families of terrorists who are killed while committing acts of terror, which is a clear incentive. The salary that they pay every month is higher than the average salary in the Palestinian Authority. And the textbooks and the television programs that are controlled by the government all feature incitement against Israel and against Jews. And so, there's some cooperation, but sort of as culturally and societally and also financially, the Palestinian Authority is encouraging terrorism.
Well, I look forward to continuing the conversation down the road, Lahav. Thank you for joining me for your first time on the Hugh Hewitt Show and for staying up late in Israel to do that. Very greatly appreciated. Lahav Harkov, you can follow her on X at Lahav Harkov, not Hard, or at Jewish Insider, where the editor-in-chief, our friend Josh Kloschauer, has got a superstar working for him over in Israel itself in Lahav.